Welcome to Libyth. I'm glad you're here. We are in the second block of our series on the Pillow Book, and today we are going to do something that might seem, briefly, like a detour. We are going to talk about politics, about land tenure, about clan structure and marriage strategy, and the slow bureaucratic calcification of the Japanese imperial system in the late 10th century. I am aware that none of that sounds like it belongs in a series about a book made of lists and aesthetic preferences and micro-judgments of courtiers who don't know how to make a graceful exit. But here is the thing about the Pillow Book. You cannot understand what Shonagon is doing, why she writes the way she writes, why her wit has the specific edge it has, why the book performs such confident authority while radiating such precise anxiety underneath. You cannot understand any of that without understanding the world that produced her, and that she was always, in some sense, writing against. So let us begin with power, and let us begin with how it was legitimized, because legitimation is everything. In the Heian period, which runs, officially, from 794 to 1185 CE, with Shonagon writing somewhere in the last decade of the 10th century, authority descends, in theory, from the emperor. The emperor is not just a political figure. He is a sacred one. His authority derives from his bloodline, which is held to descend from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and his function is not to govern in any executive sense, but to embody the cosmic order, to perform the rituals that keep the world aligned, to be the still center around which the celestial bureaucracy turns. This is a system in which the highest authority cannot, by definition, be exercised directly, because the emperor is too sacred to be administrative, too celestially significant to get his hands dirty with the actual machinery of rule. What this creates, structurally, is a permanent gap between symbolic power and actual power. The emperor is always the source of all authority, and the emperor almost never wields that authority directly. Someone else does it for him. And in the period when Shonagon is writing, that someone else is the Fujiwara clan, specifically the regent, the sessho when the emperor is a minor, the kampaku when he is an adult, who governs in the emperor's name with a thoroughness that has made the emperor himself, over the course of several generations, into something approaching a ceremonial object. The Fujiwara did not overthrow the imperial house. That would have been politically disastrous and cosmically illegitimate. Instead, they made themselves indispensable to it, married their daughters into it, ensured that the next emperor would always be the son of a Fujiwara woman, which meant the next regent would always be the maternal grandfather or uncle of the emperor, which meant the Fujiwara were always governing their own descendants, which is one of the most elegant and quietly devastating power structures in political history. The mechanism is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is not just a historical curiosity. It is the system that determines everything about Shonagon's world, including her position in it and the political stakes of the book she wrote. The Fujiwara placed their daughters in the imperial household as consorts. If a daughter produced an emperor, the clan's position was secured. This meant that the most important political acts in Heian Japan were not battles or edicts or legislative sessions. They were marriages and births. The delivery room was the seat of government. The competition between Fujiwara factions and the clan was internally competitive in ways that produced real, sometimes lethal, political conflict, played out as a competition to get the right daughter into the right consort position at the right moment, producing the right imperial heir. Power was biological before it was administrative. And this produced a culture in which women were simultaneously the most important political instruments and the least formally empowered actors in the system. This is the world Shōnagon entered when she became a lady-in-waiting in the court of Empress Taishi, probably around 993 CE. Taishi was the consort of Emperor Akijō, beautiful, accomplished, witty, adored by the emperor. And she was also the daughter of Fujiwara no Michitaka, which placed her at the center of one of the two main competing factions within the Fujiwara clan. The other faction was led by Michitaka's brother Michinaga, who would go on to become the dominant political figure of the entire era, the man who composed that famous poem about the full moon and his own glory, who would place 4 of his daughters in imperial positions and produce 3 emperors. Michinaga and Taishi's faction, led by Taishi's brother Korchika after Michitaka's death, were engaged in a political struggle that was, in every formal sense, a family dispute, and that was, in every real sense, a war for control of the state. This is the political environment in which Shōnagon wrote her book. This is the context in which she made her lists of beautiful things and irritating things, and people who fail to understand what the moment requires. The stakes were never decorative. Now let us talk about the formal structure of the government, because the formal structure is fascinating precisely in how completely it failed to describe reality. The Heian state had inherited from Tang China a system called ritsuryō, a comprehensive legal code that prescribed, in considerable detail, the organization of the central government, the chain of administrative authority, the procedures by which laws were enacted and taxes collected and justice administered. There was a council of state. There were 8 ministries. There were elaborate procedures for the appointment of officials. There were court ranks, numbered 1 through 9, each subdivided into upper and lower grades, that determined everything about how a person was treated. What color their robes could be, what vehicles they could ride, what level of ceremony surrounded their movements, who bowed to whom, who spoke first. The ritsuryō system was, on paper, a sophisticated and internally coherent mechanism of imperial governance. In practice, by the time Shonagon was writing, it was a theater. The real work of government happened in the private administrative apparatus of the Fujiwara household, which had developed its own staff, its own record-keeping, its own chain of command, entirely separate from the formal state bureaucracy. The formal positions still existed. People still held the titles, still attended the formal councils, still wore the robes appropriate to their rank. But the actual decisions were made elsewhere, in the domestic space of Fujiwara power, and the formal machinery was maintained largely as a source of legitimating ceremony and a distributional mechanism for patronage. You needed the state bureaucracy to justify your rank, and your rank determined your access to state revenues, so the formal system could not be abandoned. But it had become a shell around a very different interior. This matters for understanding Shōnagon's position, because the court rank system, the Kurai system, was the mechanism that structured her entire social world and her place within it. The court was not a single homogeneous elite. It was a finely stratified hierarchy, in which the difference between rank 3 and rank 4 was a universe, in which the difference between upper rank 4 and lower rank 4 was significant, in which every interaction was mediated by the precise positions of the participants in this elaborate grid of status. And Shōnagon was not at the top of this grid. She was never at the top of this grid. She was the daughter of a zuryō, a provincial governor, which placed her in the class of middle and lower court nobility that served the high aristocracy, but was not of it. Her father was Kiyohara no Madasuke, a poet of some distinction, which gave her cultural capital but not social capital, education without the birth rank that would have made the education superfluous. She was, in the precise vocabulary of Heian social taxonomy, in the service class, which meant she could enter the palace, could attend the empress, could be present in the most refined and powerful space in Japan, and could never quite forget that she was there to serve, not to belong. The zuryō class deserves a little attention, because it is the key to a great deal of the tension that runs through the pillow book like a current. Provincial governors were appointed by the central government to administer the provinces, to collect taxes, maintain order, oversee the local administration of the ritsuryō code. In the early Heian period, this had been a middling appointment, a bureaucratic posting for men of middling rank. But over the course of the 10th century, as the Shun system, private, tax-exempt land estates, expanded at the expense of the public domain, the provincial governors became the primary mechanism by which the central government extracted revenue from the provinces, and this made them extremely lucrative postings. A man appointed as provincial governor could, if he was willing to be aggressive about extraction, become extremely wealthy. The zuryō class accumulated wealth that put many of them economically above courtiers of higher rank, who were dependent on the increasingly inadequate revenues of the formal state. They were rich. They were educated. They were despised by the high aristocracy for their lack of lineage, admired for their money, and necessary for the functioning of the economy. They were, in the language of any era, new money, and the high aristocracy treated them with exactly the mixture of contempt and dependence that old money always extends to new. Shonagon grew up in this class. She was not a peasant, was not even middling. She was educated, cultured, the daughter of a distinguished poet, and she was not a Fujiwara, not a Minamoto of the inner court, not of the lineage that would have made everything else irrelevant. When she entered Teishi's court, she entered a world in which everyone knew exactly where everyone else ranked, and the knowing was constant and inescapable and productive of exactly the kind of anxiety that drives someone to write a book that performs, on every single page, the confidence of someone who has nothing to prove. The political situation deteriorated around Shonagon with a speed that must have been dizzying. Michitaka died in 995. His son Korchika, who had seemed to be consolidating the faction's position, made a political miscalculation, or perhaps several, and in 996 was accused of crimes against a retired emperor and exiled. The exile of Korchika was the destruction of Teishi's faction. Her political protection evaporated. Michinaga moved into the position of unchallenged dominance within the Fujiwara clan, and almost immediately placed his own daughter Shoshi in the imperial household as a rival consort to Teishi. The two consorts, Teishi, beloved by the emperor, politically ruined, Shoshi, backed by the most powerful man in Japan, coexisted in a state of contained antagonism that was the central political drama of the imperial court for the remaining years of Teishi's life. Teishi died in 1001 after complications from childbirth. She was 24. Shonagon's world, the world that the pillow book describes, ended with her. What does all this mean for the book? It means that the pillow book is written against a background of political collapse that the text never directly describes, but that shapes every word. When Shonagon writes about the beauty of Teishi's court, the grace of the empress, the quality of the conversations and the poems and the moments of shared laughter. She is writing about a world that, as she is writing, is already gone. The confidence of the prose is a form of elegy. The insistence on recording these beautiful things is the insistence of someone who knows they are not going to come back. The lists are a way of making permanent what the political system has already erased. And this is why the social structure matters so much for reading the book. Shōnagon's position, her class, her rank, her relationship to the political fortunes of Teishi's faction is not background. It is the generating condition of everything she writes. The micro-judgments of courtiers who don't know how to behave are not just gossip. They are the assertions of someone whose only power is the power of judgment, who has no formal authority and therefore invents her own, who measures everyone around her with a precision that is partly aesthetic and partly defensive. I am better than you at this, even if you outrank me. I see this more clearly than you do. Even if you hold the appointment I will never hold. The wit is a weapon. The observation is a claim. The beautiful notebook under the pillow is a form of resistance that looks, on the surface, like nothing more than a woman writing down the things that please her. It is never nothing more than that. It is always also the thing underneath. The economic structure of the Heian world reinforces all of this. The Shun system, the private estate system that was hollowing out the public revenue base throughout the 10th century, meant that wealth was increasingly concentrated in the hands of the great noble houses and the Buddhist temples, both of whom held tax-exempt private estates that grew larger as the public domain shrank. The Fujiwara clan was the largest private landholding entity in Japan. The court rank system, meanwhile, still determined access to the remaining public revenues, state stipends, official perquisites, which meant that rank was not just social status, it was an economic claim. The gift economy at court, the constant exchange of silk, incense, lacquerware, poems, seasonal greetings, ceremonial objects, was not decorative. It was the primary mechanism by which relationships were maintained, debts were acknowledged, alliances were sealed, and the social order was reproduced. When Shonagon records the gifts exchanged at court, when she describes the quality of the paper used for a particular letter, or the scent of the incense used in a particular ceremony, she is recording economic facts dressed in aesthetic language, which is exactly the way the Heian court preferred to conduct its economic life. The family structures of the aristocracy were, by the standards of almost any other culture in world history, unusual, and they are worth understanding because they determined the lived experience of almost every woman in Shonagon's world. Marriage among the Heian aristocracy was practiced in a form called tsuken, which is sometimes translated as visiting marriage, but which is really a system in which the husband visits the wife at her family home, rather than the wife moving into the husband's household. Children were raised by their mothers, in their mothers' family homes. Women retained their ties to their birth families in a way that was structurally impossible in systems where women moved permanently into their husbands' households. This meant that women were, in one sense, more rooted. They were not uprooted from their families and transplanted into alien households. But it also meant that their security was perpetually dependent on their husband's continued interest, since a man who stopped visiting had effectively ended the marriage without any formal procedure, and a woman in that position was simply abandoned in her family home, which might or might not have the resources to support her. Polygyny was normalized among the elites. A man of high rank might have several wives or consorts, ranked by status, and the status of a consort determined the prospects of her children. This is why the placement of daughters in the imperial household was so politically significant, not just because it gave the clan access to power, but because the rank of the consort position determined whether her son would be in contention for the throne or would spend his life in secondary positions, well-treated but never central. Every woman in the court was caught in this structure. Her value was partly her own, her beauty, her wit, her poetic skill, her refinement, and partly instrumental, determined by what her body might produce and what her family connections might secure. Shōnagon herself navigated this world with a deliberate opacity. She was likely married, references in the text suggest as much, but she never discusses her husband directly, never names him in ways that would make him a presence in the book. She may have been divorced or widowed. She chose, whatever her actual domestic situation, to present the book as a text about court life, about Taishi's world, about the beauty and wit and social intensity of the palace, and to leave her own private life almost entirely in shadow. This is itself a choice, and it is a choice that tells you something about what the book is for. The book is not about her life. The book is about what she noticed. The book is the act of attention, not the life that attention was housed in. The community that the pillow book describes is, by any objective measure, vanishingly small. The Heian capital, Kyoto, then called Heian-kyo, had a population of perhaps 100,000 people. The court world that Shonagon inhabits, the world of people who matter in the terms the book operates in, was perhaps a few hundred individuals. The palace complex was a city within a city, a bounded space of ceremony and surveillance in which everyone knew everyone and everyone was constantly observing and being observed. The seasons structured collective time, the cherry blossoms in spring, the heat of summer, the melancholy of autumn, the cold of winter, and the ceremonial calendar structured collective behavior, with festivals and rituals and observances marking the rhythm of the year in ways that everyone participated in together. This is the community that Shōnagon is writing from and about, not Japan, not the Heian period broadly, but this specific, tiny, intensely watched, intensely beautiful world, which she loved with the particular ferocity of someone who knew it was always about to end. Next block, we turn to the book itself, its structure, its characters, and what it means beneath its surface. The context we've built today will make everything that follows more legible. I'll see you there. That's all for today on Libyth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week.